Good morning, church. Good to see you this morning. We're glad that you're here. Glad that we're able to see each other this week. You know, it's fine talking into a computer, but it sure is nice to see faces. And so it's good to see you. Let me have just a couple of moments to make a couple of announcements right quick. We continue to add to our track series. This week, 2 more were added. What Must I Do to Be Saved? And then one that I think I entitled You Are Invited. It's just an introduction to River Road Congregation. Feel free to pick one of those up and give them to a friend that might be interested in those subjects, or to study for yourself. They're just really short and take you 2 minutes to read. And so we hope that you'll avail yourself of that. Also, don't forget next week the fellowship meal, the 5th Sunday, as Jay announced it a while ago. And Jay said, something about being afraid of utensils and not using the same utensils. I was not planning to use Jay's fork at all. I don't know about you, but I was not. But I hope you'll come. Hope you'll invite somebody. Part of our invite a friend, or invest in a friend, invite a friend, of course, to come and be with us as well and enjoy that. And then, of course, the service right after that, and the 6 o'clock service on the 5th as well. Also, another announcement is that I was afraid, some were afraid that I couldn't see the clock, and thus we were having long sermons. So I catch the gesture. That's that's good, to say the least. But also, next month, February of last year, you might recall we did Moments with the Master, and we asked you to read for each day, like the first chapter of Matthew went with the first day, and we read Matthew. Well, this year it's entitled Back to the Beginning, and we ask you to read the book of Acts. And so that will start not this week, but next week on the 1st of February, and then subsequently we will have the lessons on Sunday that will be out of certain passages for the reading of the week. And so we hope that you'll look forward to that as well. But this morning we want to talk about a subject that admittedly is not always pleasant to talk about, but it is kind of interesting, and hopefully you'll appreciate the take that I want to go on with, and so go on this journey with me for just a few moments. When we think about death, and we talk about death, we call it a lot of different things. We talk about death from the standpoint of dying, or we even talk about passing, or we talk about expiring, or we talk about giving up the ghost, or in some more rude and crude ways, the idea of kicking the bucket, we even call it, and things of that nature. And we really don't like to talk about death. We don't like to mention death. We're not fond of the subject of death. And yet the Bible paints death in a completely different picture. Paul talked about in Philippians chapter 1, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 1 that a good name's rather to be had than precious ointment, and the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. Those of you that have been blessed with children and grandchildren know the excitement and the glory of the day in which that child finally arrives, and you're able to see him or her, and you're able to experience them. You're able to see and to touch and to hold and to love and to kiss on them. And yet Solomon says that the day of one's death, which we so often mourn, and rightfully so. Don't think I am discounting the subject of grief, nor am I discounting the reality of grief, because that is a process that we have to go through in our lives when we lose a loved one, and it is very real. But it is to say that as Christians we can look upon that day in a whole different light, in a whole different way. And so we ask ourselves, how was it that Paul was able to say that death is gain? Well, that's the journey and the path that I want to go on this morning. I want us to understand that death is really defined as the separation of the body and the spirit. That is, the body, James says in James chapter 2, the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead. He describes faith, and he describes the idea of faith is maintained by doing the things that God has told us to do. But he tells us that death is a separation of the body and the soul. Solomon said the same thing in Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7. He talks about the body will return to the dust of the earth and the soul to God that gave it. You see, we look at death as a society. We look at it as an ending. Well, there are certain endings that we'll talk about this morning. But while there are certain endings that we want to talk about with regards to things happening, it's not just the end, as we will see. Death really is gained, first of all, this morning because it signals an end to our trials and to our suffering. Paul would talk about that he was ready to be poured out as a drink offering, and the time of his departure was at hand. He'd fought, he said in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7, "I've fought a good fight, I've kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me in that day, not to me only, but to all them also that love is appearing." Paul said, all the trials of this life are soon coming to an end. What a glorious thought that is. We see life, we understand the toil. We understand the struggles. Matter of fact, when Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, do you remember the promise that God made, if you will? That to the woman, he said that she would have pain in childbearing, to the man that he would have thorns and thistles, upon which that he would have to gather his livelihood. Genesis chapter 3, beginning in verse 16. Yeah, man that is born of a woman is a few days and full of trouble. That's what Job reminds us in Job 14. Life is full of toil. Life is full of trials. Life is full of suffering, heartaches and hurts and disappointments, things that we don't like to think about, but yet a reality. We don't like to, as we go back over our life, you just simply say, well, you know, those were terrible days, but yet at the same time, too, we made them through those days. Well, how did we do that? Well, just a little bit at the time. Just a day here, a day there, a toil here, a trial there, a suffering here. And step by step, we made it through. None of us are immune to those troubles and trials. If you stop and think about it, Paul talks about it in 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter. Paul talks about his toils and his troubles and his trials. Paul talks about shipwrecks and beatings. Paul talks about being in perils. Paul talks about being weariness. Paul talks about his difficulties in life. And yet, Paul made it through. Jesus had his troubles. Jesus had his heartaches. Jesus had his times in which he was run out. Jesus had his times in which people talked about him. Jesus had his sufferings as he died upon the cross. He understood troubles and trials. We all do. We all have them. But we ask sometimes, when's this going to come to an end? Well, you say, well, at death. Well, preacher, I don't like that. Well, think about it again. Think about the fact that you're not going to have them forever. Think about the fact that they're not going to carry you through eternity. That they're going to one day, they're going to come to an end. And so Paul, in his infinite wisdom by inspiration, would write in Romans the 8th chapter, that wonderful chapter, one of my favorite chapters in all the Bible. He would talk about how that he reckoned that the suffering of this present time is not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in heaven. In other words, it's temporary. It's here today and it's gone tomorrow. And so John, in Revelation chapter 14, that book that we're so enamored with, that book that we're so confused about, John is exiled on the Isle of Patmos. And he sees all of these things in a vision. He sees all of these candlesticks and these beasts, and he sees all of these things. And I think there's a simple answer to that, as I've shared with you before. Because John wrote these things which must shortly come to pass. These are things with regards to the Roman Empire. John would often get caught up, though, in that vision which he would see. And John would have to be reminded on several occasions in that great book, hey, write, don't forget, Write this down. And so he was reminded in Revelation chapter 14, verse 13, blessed are they that die in the Lord from henceforth, yes, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors. You see, John had to be reminded to write that, and I'm glad the Spirit reminded him to write that because I appreciate that verse. Blessed are they that die in the Lord. Blessed are those that are God's children that die in the Lord, that they may rest from their labors. You see, their labors, their toils come to an end. Death is gain, and Paul saw death as gain because he understood that all of the trials and all the tribulations that he had gone through, and all the toils and trials and tribulations that all of man goes through come to an end. And so death is gain because of the end that it brings. Death is gain also because it signals a new beginning. You see, it's not a bitter ending. It's really a new beginning. What a wonderful thought Paul would talk about in 2 Corinthians, the 4th chapter. He would say in verse 17 that our light affliction, which is but for a moment, works in us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. While we look not at the things that are seen, but the things that are not seen. And the reason being because the things that are not seen are eternal. Paul says, what? Paul says that there, if you will, there is that which is physical. There is that which is present. But there is that which is eternal. There is that which lingers on. There is that which continues. There is that which is different than this. Now, he goes on to talk about, for we know, chapter 5, verse 1, the earthly house of this tabernacle is dissolved, or this tent is dissolved. We have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. When we die, when our bodies are placed into Mother Earth, and we are no more physically, we are not dead completely. Remember what we said a while ago? Death is a separation of the body and the spirit. The body, as we said in Ecclesiastes 12, goes back to the dust of the earth, but the spirit goes to God that gave it. You see, Job asked the question in Job 14, verse 14, if a man dies, shall he live again? The answer is yes. How do I know that? Because Job answers that. In Job 19, Job makes the statement, he says, though after my flesh worms destroy my body, yet my soul will see God. You see, Job understood that there's life beyond this life. The psalmist David understood that as well in Psalm 23 and verse 6. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Paul, we've already seen, believed that once again there was life beyond this life. David in 2 Samuel chapter 12 talked about how that when his son passed, how that he could not come to him. But David says, I will go to him. What's the point? The point is that there's something to look forward to. There's something yet to be. There was a man I read back in the 1300s that on his wife's tombstone, she passed before he did, he wrote birth, or on her tombstone he had written birth and the date in which she was born. And he did not like the word died. And so he put this word, ascended, and the date she had passed. We may live in the land of the dying, but one day we'll go to the land of the living. You see, Paul said it was better because he realized that there was something that awaits him. There was something yet to be. You've heard probably the story of Sister Jane. Sister Jane was ill of health, and she called for her preacher one day to come. She wanted to talk to him, and so he did. And when he arrived there, she was sitting up in bed with a smile on her face. But they had this good conversation. It was a conversation in which she kind of just talked to him about her life. You see, she was trying to prepare him for the sermon which he would soon preach, called her funeral sermon. And she told her about her life and how she grew up and how she lived. And she told him some of her favorite songs. And she told him some of her favorite passages. And they had a good, long talk. And then Sister Jane said, now, I have some requests that I want you to pass on to the funeral director. He said, I'll be glad to. And so she said, first of all, when they put me in that casket, I want a Bible in my hands. And if it's not in my hands, lay it off to the side. That will be fine. But I want a Bible with me. And he said, well, that's fine, but why? And she said, because I had one in my hands most of my life. And he said, yes, you did. And she said, I want people to see that. And then Sister Jane said, but in my hand specifically, I want a fork. Now, you've probably heard the story. But the preacher said, a fork? And he said, yes. And he said, I don't understand. And she said, I want a fork because, through the years I have been at no telling how many church dinners. And he said, yeah, that's right. And she said, in sitting there after you get your food, you sit there and there'd be some hostess or somebody come by and they would take your plate and throw it away and they'd say, hold on to your fork. And she said, I'd hold on to my fork because I knew chocolate pie or chocolate cake or coconut cake was coming. I knew something better was coming, and we were going to get to enjoy that. Dear friends, when we die, the separation that we that are still alive feel, that hurt, that angst is real. But understand that Paul was able to say death is gain because he knew that he wasn't finished, that he had just simply ascended, that there was something better. And so he looked for a home which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And so in his walk by faith, he realized there's something better. But death is gain also because we enter into a rest. What a thought that is. In Hebrews chapter 4, actually beginning in verse 1, the Hebrew writer is talking about our own personal obedience and our obedience to God and to His way. And for those that obey God, He reminds us that they shall enter into a rest. Verse 9. We think of passing away or death. We don't think of it necessarily as a rest, but it is. We rest, as we've already seen in Revelation 14, verse 12, we rest from our labors. You've put a lot of work in your lifetime. And many of you are retired. You're drawing pensions. If you have pensions, you're drawing Social Security. Or you're drawing maybe something that you saved up and plus others. But you say, I'm resting from my labors. I worked for 50 years. I went in every day and I did this or I did that or I did the other. And yes, you did. And you're to be commended. But when we die, there's a rest that the Hebrew writer says that we enter. A rest from our labors, a rest from our work, a rest from our toil, a rest that will take us through eternity. Now, it doesn't mean that we're not going to do anything. If you go back and read Revelation chapter 22, John, right there, the last two chapters of the book of Revelation, John deals with the idea of heaven in verse 21. And in verse 22, he's still talking about heaven. And he talks about those that are gathered around the Lord will be his servants. Preacher, I served the Lord here on earth. Surely I'm not going to serve him again. Oh, yes, but this service is completely different. Can you imagine singing for eternity? Preacher, I don't want to sit next to, now y'all fill in the blank, but I don't want to sit next to them if we're going to be singing for eternity. Oh, yeah, you do. Yeah, you do, without a doubt. Do you imagine praising his name? Do you imagine just being able to sit there and take up the wonders of heaven and not be able to thank him? Because when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as a star, we've no less days to sing his praise than when we first begun. Oh, I know that's not inspired, but I know how true it is. That rest that awaits us. This old tired body is able to be put down. The labors that were ours for days are no more. And we're able to enter a rest. A rest that Paul talks about. A rest that he talks about in verse 23 of Philippians chapter 1. While he talks about for me to live as Christ and to die as gain. He says, I am really caught between two places. Having a desire to depart, be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain here in the flesh is more needful of you. Now, I want you to think about the fact that Paul wrote that while in imprisonment. Now, it is believed, time-wise, that Paul will get out, that was written right at the end of the book of Acts, and that Paul will get out of Roman imprisonment, and that he will then spend a few years out and a few more years before he eventually passes away. And so we're talking about 62 AD when he wrote those words in Philippians 2, and he died, it's believed, around 68 AD. And so Paul lived with the idea, knowing that rest was awaiting him. And so we die, or we look towards death, and we say, is death gain? The answer is yes. Why? Because of the rest that is promised us. It never grows old. It's an inheritance. It's incorruptible. It's undefiled. It fades not away. And it's reserved for you. Because you see, one of the best pictures I've ever seen or read about with regards to death is the picture of an individual that talked about watching a ship. They said life is so much like watching a ship. And it is. Stand on the shore. Have you ever watched a ship go from right to left or left to right as you stood on the shore and watched it? Maybe you stood on the riverbank and watched a boat go past. But let's go back to the idea, the image of standing on the beach shore and watching a ship pass. Off in the distance, we see but a dot. We wonder what it is. We wonder where it's coming from and where it's going. We wonder what it's transporting. And we sit and wonder so much about what it is and what's going on. And as it gets closer, we see why it's a boat. And then we see what kind of boat it is. And we see what it has on it. And we begin to see more of the details. And it gets so close to us that we're able even to see the logo that's on the side. And then we watch as it keeps on passing. We have not moved. We're still standing, and it's passing us by. And we're beginning to wonder, where is it going to go? Where's it going to end up? Where's its destination? What's it going to be? And then it becomes that dot, and then it is completely gone out of sight. But it has not passed away before the next man that is on down the beach has seen that dot coming. And now sees it passing. Life is that way. It does not end. It keeps going. And so death is gain because of the rest that it brings us as we continue to pass. But then death is gain because it really is in our best interest. Flesh and blood, according to 1 Corinthians 15, verse 50, cannot inherit the kingdom of God. We need death. Preacher, we don't need death. I want you to think about it. If this world continues as is, and I realize that's an if, but if this world were to continue as if, and never change, and all we did is grow older, and our body grew sicker and tireder, how miserable our life would be. But we know that one day this body puts off and goes back to the dust of the earth. But we know that the physical, while passing away, the spiritual continues on, as we've already seen. And so it really is in our best interest. We really need death. We really need to put off this physical. Why? Because we can't get into heaven without passing. You might say, well, wait a minute, preacher. Let me ask you this. How about the living that are going to take place, are going to be alive when the Lord comes back? Paul answers that question. In 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about the resurrection of the Christians and he talks about passing from this world, Paul answers a lot of questions that evidently the church at Corinth was concerned about. One of the things that they were concerned about was that those that had died were going to miss the return of the Lord, and therefore they were going to miss heaven. And Paul reminds them that that's not the case. Paul reminds them that the mortal must put on immortality. The corrupt must put on incorruption. Why? Then shall be brought to pass the saying that death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O grave, where's your sting? But then Paul goes on and he says, but thanks be to God, which gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. You see, it really is in our best interest to simply, as the ship, move on, to move from this life to that which is eternal, to move from the here and now to be with God in heaven above. And so, Paul said, death is gain. For the individual that's ready to pass, for the individual that's the child of God, for the individual that has completed the steps of salvation and have lived the life and are able to say, I've fought the good fight, I've kept the faith. Death is a beautiful thing. But preacher, that's just so final. That's so terrible. To think that one day our body will be changed. And not only will it be changed, but it'll be transformed in Philippians chapter 3, verse 21 into a glorious body. Not having spot or wrinkle or anything. Paul said in Philippians 3, verse 21. But I don't like to talk about death. And you've spent 30 minutes, 45 minutes of my time today, and you've talked about death. Well, I know. It's not a pleasant topic. It's a topic really that we reserve for funerals and for memorial services. But you see, the reality of it is the sunset of our life is really a beautiful thing. Yeah, the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. Now, I'm not trying to hasten that coming. I'm not trying to hasten that coming for you as well. Did you hear about the man that went to sleep in church all the time? And it just disgusted the preacher. I don't worry about it. If you go to sleep during my preaching, I don't worry about it. It's when you go to sleep in the song service that I worry about you. But this man went to sleep all the time during church. And the preacher just grew, every Sunday he just grew more and more upset till finally he thought he had come up with the ultimate plan. And so, one Sunday, he was preaching, and oh, that good brother, he went to sleep. When he went to sleep, the preacher said, everybody that wants to go to heaven, stand up. And this old brother, of course, he's asleep. He still was sitting. And so the preacher got down out of the pulpit, went over there beside that brother, and he whispered in his ear, and he said, don't you want to go to heaven? And the old man said, yeah, but I thought you was getting up a load today. I'm not getting up a load today to pass from this world. But I want you to know that when it comes, it's not going to be as bad as we think. For those of us that are left behind, for those of us that have stood at the caskets and the graves of oh so many that we've loved. And I don't know, I really don't know how many funerals I've preached and how many families' hands I've held and how many held my hand when I was standing by my loved ones. And how it hurts. It's real. I know that. I understand that. But those that have passed have been blessed. This morning, you stand on this side of eternity with the opportunity to make whatever is wrong in your life right, so that when you stand facing eternity and you stand before the Lord on the day of judgment, you hear these words, well done, good and faithful servant. This morning, if you're not a New Testament child of God, or you're an individual that needs to rededicate your life, our prayer is that you'll come while together we stand and sing. Yeah.